I'm scared at times, but we have to lift up our heads and act. We're here fighting. Paulo Paulino Guajajara, an indigenous activist killed in Brazil while trying to protect the Amazon. By Varsha Sharma, published on December 30, 2019 at 6:36 p.m. Getty Images. The impeachment of President Donald Trump. President Donald Trump had one hell of a year, but nothing tops what happened in the final weeks of 2019, impeachment. Being only the third president to be impeached in all of U.S. history is now forever a part of his legacy. In fact, I've heard some people are now referring to him as impeachment matters from a modern and historical standpoint, and also because it means Trump's corrupt behavior broke through the noise in a major way. People paid attention to the Ukraine scandal, his abuses of power, his obstruction of Congress, and in the end, a majority of Americans supported his impeachment, and even his removal from office. Remember, his impeachment wouldn't have happened without a Democratic majority in the House, proving once again that elections, yes, even the midterms, matter. Watch the 5 biggest moments of the hearings here. We also learned a number of bombshells during the investigation process, including that the president is still seeking foreign help in the 2020 elections, remember his comments for China to intervene, and that his personal lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, who is not a government official, has been running a shadow foreign policy for Trump in various countries, unbeknownst to many of the actual American officials stationed in them. We salute Fiona Hill for delivering some of the most compelling, nonpartisan testimony of 2019. Know this, we learned from the whistleblower complaint that there's a separate, secret server that the White House is using for sensitive transcripts of Trump calls with foreign leaders. Got to see the call summary of the Trump-Zelensky conversation, but we still don't know how many other calls are on that server, and what Trump might have said that was deemed politically sensitive. Let's hope we find out more in 2020. Getty Images. People of the Year. Hong Kong protesters. One of this year's biggest political stories was undoubtedly the Hong Kong protests, a solid 6 months of demonstrations from mostly young people, voicing support for democracy against one of the most authoritarian regimes in the world. The protests started in the first half of 2019 when the government of Hong Kong, which is technically part of China but operates independently from the mainland under a one country, two systems rule, proposed a bill that would allow the extradition of criminal suspects to China. This was highly controversial, because China is known for its unfair treatment of dissidents and activists, including human rights abuses. See, the bookseller that was abducted and detained because he sold books critical of Chinese leaders. Hong Kong Chief Executive Carrie Lam announced she would indefinitely delay the bill, which wasn't enough for protesters who wanted it scrapped entirely, and so the protests grew to include concerns over police brutality, surveillance, and other abuses of the state. The police cracked down harshly on protesters several times, including at universities. At least 2 people have been killed, more than 2,600 injured, and more than 6,000 arrested. Some marches saw more than 1 million turnout, according to organizers. They shut down airports, apologized for the inconvenience, and demanded better treatment. The Hong Kong protesters were named Person of the Year in Time's 2019 Reader poll, and as of this writing, they're still protesting. Police tear-gassed and arrested protesters on Christmas Eve, and the massive annual New Year's Eve fireworks show was cancelled because of public safety concerns. Know this, the spotlight on Hong Kong also brought some much-needed attention to China's treatment of Uyghurs, an ethnic Muslim minority being held in concentration and forced labor camps. Learn about the plight of more than 1 million Muslims in China here. Getty Images. In Syria, the worst humanitarian crisis of the decade. 2019 marked 8 years of war in Syria. 8 years, 500,000 people killed, more than 5 million refugees who escaped, and more than 7 million people internally displaced. It's the worst humanitarian crisis of the decade, and it's sadly continuing into the next one. The Syrian civil war, which started as an armed conflict when Syrian President Bashar al-Assad and his armed forces violently suppressed protests that grew out of the 2011 Arab Spring, has also become a proxy war. The US, Russia, Turkey, and Iran are all involved on various sides, and this year, under President Trump, the US stepped back, allowing Turkish forces to invade in a highly controversial decision, and also allowing Russia to regain more territory. This short documentary we produced on the conflict, Through Our Eyes, Life Under Siege, is from last year, but I highly recommend watching it to get a sense of what daily life is still like for many Syrian civilians, and how you can help. Notice, the Syrian conflict is the second deadliest war of the 21st century, according to the Encyclopedia Britannica. The Second Congo War, which spanned 1998 to 2003, is the first. Life expectancy in Syria was 70 years before the conflict, and has since plunged to just 55 years old. Getty Images. The Amazon is burning, and Brazil doesn't know what to do with its leader. The Amazon is on fire, and it's all Leonardo DiCaprio's fault. At least, that's what the president of Brazil wants you to believe. Jair Bolsonaro was elected last year and sworn in as the new president on January 1, 2019, and it's been a rocky road ever since. The far-right leader is anti-immigration, anti-abortion, anti-LGBTQ rights, and anti-environment, so much so that his government has rolled back protections for the Amazon and allowed farmers to burn the world's largest tropical rainforest. According to a Brazilian scientific research unit, deforestation and destruction of the Amazon increased by 88% from June 2018 to June 2019. President Bolsonaro called the data false and fired its research director, as purposefully set fires spread and created out-of-control wildfires this fall, threatening indigenous communities and all kinds of wildlife. Bolsonaro blamed non-governmental organizations, NGOs, and celebrities like Leo DiCaprio for contributing to them. Don't worry, it's not true, and no, it doesn't really make sense. Leo, ever the environmental activist, does want you to know that the future of these irreplaceable ecosystems is at stake, and he's proud to stand with the groups protecting them. Know this: Bolsonaro rejected $22 million in aid for the Amazon because it came from European governments, and he says they didn't need the handout for a fake crisis. He did end up ultimately accepting some of it, but only from Britain. Meanwhile, here are 5 ways you can help, from the World Wildlife Foundation. Getty Images. Mass protests topple corrupt leaders around the world. Bolsonaro, Trump, the Chinese government. There were a lot of autocrats and autocratic-leaning heads of state to fight in 2019. But people around the world proved they are more than up for the challenge. From Lebanon to Iraq, from Puerto Rico to Sudan, millions of ordinary citizens rose up in mass protests and, in all of these cases, managed to topple their corrupt leaders and governments. April 2019, Sudanese President Omar al-Bashir is overthrown by protesters after a 30-year reign, due to anger over the economy and cuts to bread and fuel subsidies. July 2019, Puerto Rico Governor Ricardo Rossello and 2 top officials resign after weeks of protests prompted by a leaked text message scandal highlighting corruption, sexism and homophobia in the government. October 2019, Lebanese Prime Minister Saad Hariri announces his resignation after weeks of protests over a stagnant economy, unemployment and corruption. November to December 2019, the Iraqi president and prime minister submit their resignations after mass protests against corruption and a particularly violent crackdown that left at least 400 people dead in civil unrest. Notice a theme here: many of the protests around the world had this in common: fighting against corruption in government. Not all of the resignations above led immediately to change. In many cases, the transition of power is long, arduous and complicated, but when people's voices are heard, it's more than a start. Know this is far from a comprehensive list. The Washington Post has a good rundown here, in an article on the Year of the Street Protester, and Wikipedia has a comprehensive list on this global protest wave of 2019. Let's keep that same energy going into 2020, shall we? Thanks for reading. We've got 2 more special end-of-year editions coming your way, and then back to business as usual on January 2nd. See you then. Varsha Sharma, senior correspondent. Now this video of the day. Let's block ads. Why?